Failing councils, feckless or underfunded? Why are donuts so addictive? And will hydrogen heat our homes? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative peer and former Boris Johnson advisor Kulveer Ranger, Labour MP Lloyd Russell Moyle, Sienna Rogers from the House Magazine and the Daily Telegraph's Annabel Denham. On today's programme.
This is the most difficult time that I've ever experienced. Councils across the country are not receiving the money that they need to have to run the services that government expect us to run.
Another council goes bust. Are they underfunded or making bad financial decisions? Ultra-processed foods, are they hijacking our children's taste buds? Chef and restaurateur Thomasina Myers joins us live.
That's what we're now doing with hydrogen, because we want to be the Klondike of carbon capture and storage, the Qatar of hydrogen.
The government abandons a trial to heat houses with hydrogen amidst local protests. Let's start with this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Tax critics, it says, are taking glass-half-empty approach, says Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. He's been defending the tax cuts announced in the autumn statement by the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, and that was from an interview with The Spectator. So my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Kulveer, is the Prime Minister right to insist that we look at this government's tax record with the glass half full?
Well, we do, because obviously there's context, as we say. And the Prime Minister, and I've heard him speak several times this week, he's been sort of doing the rounds, talking to the troops, as you can imagine. But I think one of the fundamental points he's been saying is that this government has had to deal with certain things. Obviously the pandemic, obviously the war in Ukraine, the cost burden. That has hit the country's borrowing amounts, and therefore tax levels have had to stay up. But they're
the highest on record, of course.
But you know, once-in-a-generation pandemic. So what he is saying now, though, and, you know, breaking news, there will be a general election next year, and he is actively looking at what's going to happen around taxation and tax cuts as part of his plan.
Right. Should we be looking at this issue glass half full and not glass half empty when it comes to tax?
Well, I think the debate around tax cuts or tax hikes misses the point, really. We have a system where tax is not fair. People who are richer will pay proportionally less national insurance than people who are poorer by almost 10% less. You know, kind of, we have tax where non-doms can evade tax. We have tax system where people can send their kids to private schools and not have to pay the VAT that they would for any other service. All those things Labour will correct, because Labour doesn't believe in necessarily raising taxes, but what we believe is in fair taxes.
But you support the cut in national insurance that was announced in the autumn statement. Your constituents will welcome it?
Yes. But he has frozen the thresholds. So actually, lots of people will not feel a benefit from these tax cuts. These tax cuts for some people will actually still be tax hikes. If you are in the lower proportion of earnings, you will not actually receive any real benefit from this.
Right, and the tax thresholds have been frozen, which has dragged an awful lot more people into higher tax bands. But on cutting national insurance, will people feel better in the new year when it comes into play?
Well, we know that this last statement, or we were talking about specifically in the statement, it was supposedly tax cutting, but overall the tax burden is incredibly high. So we can't, I mean, talking about kind of optimism, glass half full or half empty, I mean, the reality is that people feel poorer at the moment. And, you know, my situation, we've got student loan repayments, they're so high, the interest is so high. We've got all these cliff edges also in the tax system. We were talking about making the tax system fairer and reforming it as a whole. We've got these cliff edges at 50,000, the child benefit starts to get withdrawn. At 100,000, you get no support with childcare. I know we're not particularly sympathetic to people who are on 100k. But, you know, all these kind of problems within the tax system haven't been addressed, and they have been in government for 13 years.
Annabelle, what do you make of Rishi Sunak calling on us all to be a bit more positive and that criticising the the record level of tax burden overall is rather glass half empty?
What I think this speaks to is an inability from this Conservative government to really be honest with people about the true state, not just of our tax system, but also the economy as a whole. For all of his talk of cutting taxes, as we've said, we're going to have the highest tax burden in 7 decades. It's set to rise to 37% of GDP next year, up from 33% in 2019. And you can talk about the pandemic, and of course that was a massive hit to the UK finances, but actually we were on this high tax trajectory before COVID hit our shores. Unfortunately, what we have is a so-called Conservative government that seems to be committed to growing the state ever larger and raising taxes ever higher in order to fund it.
Well, I think it's a good point you make about where we are in taxation against GDP, because actually if you look at some of the mature economies across Europe, France, Germany, Italy, we're behind them on the level of taxation. So, yes, it's at a high level, and no Conservative government and no Conservative wants to see the rate of taxation well. But all these modern economies, major economies, have faced those challenges, and yet we are still behind them on the level of taxation. So there is a balance. I think the government gets it. I think, coming to your point, Sienna, 13 years, taxation has to keep moving and evolving as you go through the different challenges that we face. And I see that's where we've
Evolving meaning going up?
Well, unfortunately, it has gone up because of the challenges faced, but it does need to change, and it does need to look at. And I think, particularly around the levels, the cliff edges, and I think a more agile tax system is something that is.
It's become less fair under the Conservatives. It's become less equitable for the very wealthy and the working person. And I think that, yes, people can suffer a high tax burden if they know, one, they're getting the services that they think they're paying for, which they don't at the moment, and two, if they think there's equity, that they think that there isn't the case of them earning a little bit more and them losing out, or vice versa. And at the moment, the Conservatives, those should be Conservative mantras, they seem to have completely lost the ball on that.
Right, I mean, there is the issue, of course, of putting up taxes and putting that extra revenue into public services. That would have been something Labour might have done a decade ago, but not now.
Well, I think just by making tax fairer, you can increase revenue, and you can then support national services that are needed. I mean, some of the calculations about making tax fairer, you know, equalising rates, making sure they're continuous, getting rid of cliff edges, making sure that everyone who earns money from whatever source has to pay the same tax. Some of the calculations that say that it's to 50 to 100 billion pounds that those kinds of changes could raise altogether.
Right.
You can't grow the state quicker than that. You just need it to be fair, and then the state can start to spend.
I think we're wading into slightly dangerous territory when we start to talk about fairer taxation. That's when you start discussing things like wealth taxes. And everybody wants to live in a country where the tax system is as fair as possible, where the wealthier people are paying their share. But the problem is that previously any attempts to equalise this in any way have been proven to fail. Countries, for instance, which have tried wealth taxes have subsequently had to reverse them. I'm not saying that that's something that Labour are pushing for.
What we're talking about is if you earn money, doesn't matter if you've earned it through work or if you've earned it through rent, those profits should be paid for in the same tax system.
Except that if you're earning the money through rent, then you've bought a property out of taxed income.
Right. All right. Well, let's just mention this breaking news, because we've had interest rates come out. The Bank of England have held rates for the third time in a row at 5.25%. But the government obviously can't claim credit for that, or for inflation coming down.
Well, it can, because those are the decisions, that's the target that the Prime Minister set in place to bring inflation down. So he and the Chancellor are making decisions that are impacting the way inflation is playing out. And the Bank of England have a huge role to play in terms of the effect that interest rates have had in dampening inflation. So I think there's a combination of things there that have an impact on the complex model of the economy. But it's achieving the target that the Prime Minister set, which is reduce inflation and get more money into people's pockets and stop the effect on the cost of living crisis that's been happening.
Right. Well, one part of the public sector facing very difficult times financially are councils, or certainly quite a sizable number of them. Let's just show you this headline. BBC News: council facing bankruptcy proposes £14 million of savings. In the last 24 hours, Middlesbrough Council has announced proposals to avoid bankruptcy. There's this other another headline, managing director appointed at bankrupt council. Yes, that's in Woking. The BBC says that a new managing director is going to be brought in to sort out things there. And then, finally, bankrupt Nottingham City Council outlines major cost-cutting plans. Let's hear from Nottingham City Council's leader, David Mellon, speaking to BBC Radio Nottingham on Tuesday about the situation there.
This is the most difficult time that I've ever experienced. Councils across the country are not receiving the money that they need to have to run the services that government expect us to run. We've lost, in the last 10 years, approximately £100 million each and every year. And at the same time, inflation's gone up. The demand for adult social care has gone up. The demand and the cost of having children in our care has gone up. And in the last 12 months, there's been a huge rise in homelessness. And we have a legal duty to house people who are present as homeless.
Right, well, that was Nottingham City Council's leader talking about the pretty dire situation there. But what is life like living under a bankrupt council? Thurrock in Essex declared itself effectively bankrupt a year ago. Let's speak to resident Rob Groves, who joins me from Grays in Essex. Hello to you, Rob. What kind of changes have you noticed in the last year?
Well, obviously, our situation was very, very unique in that our council lost huge amounts of money on some risky investments. And so, yeah, life here is a little bit bleak in terms of people are feeling very angry that there's still lack of accountability as to who was actually responsible for the dire situation that we're in. Chief Executive Officer goes missing, and we're picking up the bill. We had a 10% council tax increase last year, and it looks like that could well happen year on year without any real argument from local residents, because we're suffering with general services like bin collections and maintaining roads, but also those people who are most vulnerable are impacted massively, whether that's school transport or adult social care. There's loads of cuts coming. In fact, Thurrock Council, just to service their debt, is 105% of the annual budget, over £130 million just to pay the finance for the debt that we're in. So as the leader of that Nottingham Council said, you know, we just don't have enough money to do even the basics.
Right. I mean, 10% you talked about in terms of a hike there for residents. But how worried are you about the future?
Oh, very worried, really. I mean, that was pushed through. There's a 5% limit on council tax increase, but the Secretary of State just approved a 10% increase because of our financial situation, and there's a very good chance that we're going to see that as residents year on year. And we did nothing to cause this. We know the councils have been receiving less and less finance from central government over the years, and that it's pushed back on everybody.
All right.
And really what we're facing, I think every resident in the UK will face, there is an opportunity, of course, that councils will need to sort of engage their communities more as to what they need and get better value for money.
All right.
Either out of the third sector or just communities. Like we've got a Thameside, it's our arts and culture complex. The council are looking to sell that off, and actually the community have put together a bid to take that on and save arts and culture in Thurrock. So there is optimism because the council don't have all the power anymore because they've got no money.
Rob Groves, thank you very much. Who's to blame, Colville? Is it the council or is it central government cuts?
No, let's be honest here. The councils have responsibility around their budgets and how they expend that money and what they're looking to achieve. And a number of the instances we're talking about here, as was mentioned there, is about certain decisions around investment that councils have made.
It was in this particular.
Croydon comes to mind, Birmingham comes to mind. So there are a number of decisions. And we do look at councils and we see well-paid senior civil servants, teams in those councils who have the responsibility for managing those budgets and managing the delivery of those services. And I think they have to be held accountable, as well as the political leadership at that level, around the decisions they're making.
Lloyd?
Well, it's a central government problem that they have foist upon local government in two shortfalls. One is that they haven't passed on as much money as we were passing on to local government, but we've actually required greater duties of local councils. And this is the problem. Local councils don't have discretion on whether they're going to look after that child in care. They don't have discretion on whether to look after that homeless person. If I look at Hastings Council down the road from me, they went from spending less than 2 years ago £500,000 on homelessness to now spending almost £5 million on homelessness. This is a direct result of national policies that have led to no house building, led to rental problems, and of course the rocketing interest rates that have led to this no organisation would be able to expand that quickly without some knock-on effects. And the government require them, our law requires them to do that. And what we need to do with councils, I think, is we need to be clearer on what is discretionary spending and what is required spending. In my view, is the national government should underwrite all nationally required spending, and then we can be more honest with our councils that they are spending the discretionary spending. Because at the moment, it's not that way round.
Culver?
Well, I think I understand what you're saying there, Lloyd, but if we look at the instances of extreme instances where councils have gone into debt and have
Gone bankrupt.
it's around decisions they've made. It's the decisions they made on investment. It hasn't been around service. Now, there is a longer term...
I'm not sure that's the case with Nottingham. I'm not sure that's the case with the councils that we're now seeing going on.
Right. But what we have seen has been because of investment decisions and what's been going on. I think, yes, there has been challenges, and we can all admit that there are more challenges on councils in some areas, but the discretion they have is how they are going to match those with the funding that they have. Now, the government has set up additional funds, and there's another 100 million fund for families with severe cost of living problems. So the government does look to step in and underpin those requirements.
The government scrapped the household support grant that went to councils as well, only in the last autumn statement. So the council are actively getting rid of those support funds for councils, and the net effect is a reduction in council money from the government. So you can throw a bit around here or there, but if you're cutting the major schemes that you're giving councils, of course they're going to really suffer. And it's Conservative councils as well as Labour councils that are suffering this. This is not party political.
No.
This is a national problem, and we see it in our roads, we see it every day today. And once you lose trust in your council, it's so much harder to get it back. And I think that we are at that stage now where
it is cross-party. All three councils, in fact, in those examples that I read out earlier, 6 councils have gone bankrupt since 2021. According to the Institute for Government, in real terms, central government grants were cut by 40% in the last decade. Should those cuts be reversed?
I think that they probably should. It's certainly the case that since the coalition government, there has been less money going to local councils, whilst the demands of them have only increased, particularly in areas such as social care. However, it's also the case that there are examples of terrible mismanagement of those who've been running the councils, perhaps favouring pet projects and their own agendas over what is best for local residents and providing the nuts and bolts that we all depend on. Look, I'm pro-devolution, but we clearly have a problem in this country where local councils don't have adequate tax raising revenue powers, and that needs to be addressed because it feeds into the lack of accountability, and that we raise a lot less locally than comparable countries. Another issue, of course, is that productivity has not recovered to pre-pandemic levels in the public sector. So I think there's a lot of soul-searching that needs to be done by local authorities, whilst we also acknowledge that that central funding has gone down.
Sienna?
I do think that when you see, I mean, this has come up because of Nottingham, and there were reports that Nottingham, in terms of the kind of pay that people are getting, the CEO, the other officers, 8 of them were earning over 100,000. And I think people are quite shocked by those kind of salaries when outcomes like this happen. I mean, obviously there's this political divide, right? The Labour are going to say it's all about government funding and the lack of it. The Conservative government is going to say it's all about mismanagement. And with Nottingham, there was the Robin Hood Energy project collapse. There are other expensive projects. There was the fact that kind of a ring-fenced money was then used for general funds, and that had to be paid back. But clearly, this is a wider problem, right? Because the Local Government Association, the LGA, has said that 1 in 5 are talking about being on the brink of serving these Section 114 notices. Right. So clearly, it's a broader problem.
I mean, would a Labour government reverse the cuts and increase funding to the tune of that 40% that's been taken out in the last decade?
Well, I think, first of all, a Labour government would stop the hemorrhaging of money out of councils at the moment. So we'd reverse some of the crisis points that we've had with homelessness. We would sort out social care, properly integrated into the NHS, start to look at proper funding for that, and when we've got a whole work plan for that. Those are the two biggest drains from councils.
And council tax is going up?
Well, to tell you the truth, if you resolve adult social care and homelessness funding, you actually would find that no council's going bust at the moment.
Yeah, but
anyway,
as we know, solving social care is a long-term plan or one that isn't happening.
It's a long-term plan.
Rolling it into the NHS is necessarily the best way forward.
It's a long-term
state that our healthcare service is now in.
It's a long, yes, but it's in that state because of adult social care, because they can't move people into social care provision. But an integrated service, which is what all parties agree with, we need more of, that is properly funded, that follows the cross-party reports that have come out time and time again about social care, the same with homelessness. And yes, I think we need to look at how we get more money from central government to local government. But that bit of the equation is actually completely useless. If you're not stopping the hemorrhaging of money, you'll constantly be throwing money after bad. You need to first sort out our system, and then you need to look at the money that needs to be given to local councils.
Do you think it's fair to have 5%, 10% increases in council tax in order for councils just to be able to deliver basic services on residents like Rob?
Well, I think that's a very extreme case there that we're looking at with Thurrock and what's happened there. And we can see there's been a problem in terms of an investment that they made.
Well, Birmingham's asking for 5%, the ability to raise council tax by 5%.
Yes, but I think we also have to look at the accountability, as was being said by, I think, Sienna there, about those people who've been in charge of these decisions, what they've been doing, where those investments have been going, why have they been done in that way, and learn about how better councils can actually
Are
handle
council
these
bosses
decisions.
overpaid?
I think councils have a responsibility, and budgets and people, that they're quite large organisations. They do need skilled people, but they must then be held accountable and they must be transparent about the decisions they're making. There must be scrutiny from political leadership locally about what's going on. They can't just at the end of the day
many of them are
pass
paid
the
more than
buck
the
to
Prime
national
Minister,
government.
is that right?
No, well,
Is it? Should they be paid that
well,
much?
most council leaders are paid less than a teacher. So let's put this into
A head
context.
teacher, you mean?
CEOs rather than the council leaders.
Yeah, but the reality is the council leaders are often the ones making these political judgments, and they're the ones that are going to be held accountable to it. They're underpaid, under-resourced, and actually often are running around without proper, clear guidelines. And so that does mean you rely too much on the CEOs of the councils, and you don't have a proper accountability. I think there does need to be a rebalancing. So
I would agree
we probably
with that.
do need to say, do CEOs need to earn as much? But we also need to be saying, do councillors, should they be professionalised more? Should we pay them, but also resource them? I mean, no, councillors don't have staff, for example, to do casework. So they're fiddling around doing bits like here and trying to manage a council.
I know it was a long time ago, but I mean, how much broadly were you paid when you were looking after transport at City Hall?
Well, it was
City Hall's not a council.
No,
well, but just as an example,
I think I was working with Transport for London that had over 20,000 people and senior executives on salaries that were comparable to industry, because you do need talent, you do need people. We're running a major metro system in one of the big cities of the world. So the skills and capability are right, but I agree with Lloyd around the governance structure. The political and the professional is what we're talking about now. How do you get that? How do you get the right balance of skills? And councils have more and more services and challenges that they face. But I think they've moved into areas where we've talked about risky investments, wrong kind of decision making, and that's had an impact. Mismanagement, which was highlighted by.
But the responsibility is huge, isn't it? Birmingham City Council was the largest authority, I think, in Europe, with a massive budget and a massive turnover.
That's right. You know, when you run a city like London, you've got 10 million people almost. You've got a small country that you're running. So people and actually the boroughs in London.
So they should be paid. So they should be paid.
I think it's not a pay conversation. I think it's about skills and capability and accountability. I think, Joe, what we're looking here, and I think what every taxpayer in every council will be looking for is transparency, accountability, and if things go wrong, to understand who's being held accountable, and then they can take that.
Then we also need to be clearer on what services councils are providing, because they've made a local decision to provide it, and what services they are providing basically as an agent of the government. And maybe we should tag that. Maybe when people receive their service from adult social care, it shouldn't be tagged local council. It should just be tagged government delivered by the council, because that's the reality, is they are mandated services that there is no choice about.
Well, I think the devolution point was made earlier. We do want these services to be held at a local level.
Or it's convenient for central government to blame local government.
Wasn't it ever thus? But I think the problem is...
that may be the case.
I think there's a question of, do we want local people to have their local services run by their local council, and therefore how do they fund?
Annabelle, you wanted to say
I'd
something?
be cautious looking at specific salaries and suggesting that council leaders are or are not worth it. What I think is important is ensuring, as in any job, that if you are woefully underperforming, that there are consequences to that. One of the issues that we currently have is very low voter turnout at local elections. Many people view it as an opportunity to make a protest vote, and that can lead to perhaps more fringe individuals, independents getting into power. They might be lacking the experience required to run what is in some cases a large local authority, and therefore that level of inexperience means it's not surprising that they're finding themselves in these fiscal positions, and that's something that we've got to address.
Let's talk about something completely different. In the Times, ultra-processed foods hijacking children's taste buds. Chefs and doctors have written a letter to the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, warning about the risks of these foods. We have one of them on the line, the chef and restaurateur Thomasina Myers. Hello to you. Welcome back to Politics Live. Thomasina,
Hi.
what are ultra-processed foods?
Ultra-processed foods essentially are foods that are so highly processed with a basis of corn, soy or wheat, so highly processed, normally with an emulsifier in, additives, added sugars, added fats, that essentially they have very little fibre. And in the end, if most of your diet, which is the case for secondary school children or school children in this country, if 2/3 of your diet ultra-processed, you get very negative health outcomes. And we have the worst diet in Europe, sadly. And we are seeing this cost through the NHS, through the big lag on our economy, through long-term sickness. And it's something that we can address and we can definitely do something about.
Right. Are you saying that children, as you say, secondary school children particularly, become addicted to the tastes of these foods and what's in them, and therefore very difficult to wean them back onto healthier foods?
Well, they are addictive. I mean, they're designed to be addictive. You know, I challenge anyone to open a packet of Pringles and not eat more than they probably want to eat. I definitely can't. So yes, they are definitely addictive. And we definitely know that they're bad for our health. And I think the challenge is that they are everywhere. And whilst parents on low incomes, in this kind of economic backdrop we have, parents on low incomes, too many jobs, lacking in the skills to cook their children's food, that is one side of the problem. But the other side of the problem is in our public institutions, schools, hospitals, social care. The food we are feeding the population is very bad quality, and that is what we're campaigning for.
And what do you want what do you want the Prime Minister, the government, to do?
Well, it's really simple, in fact. And the Soil Association's Schools Food for Life programme has shown immaculate results. If you feed kids delicious tasting food that happens to be better for them, they lap it up. And that is also the case in chefs and schools. So I've been a trustee of this charity for nearly 6 years now. And in every school we've been in, you see the kids just lapping up better quality food. It's completely possible. And it's time we start seeing school chefs as educators. You know, they are a massive tool for change. Right. They have this amazing power. I was in Christchurch School in North Finchley 3 weeks ago. A new chef had come in September, and the kids were raving about the food. And they all started saying healthy, which is not something chefs in schools ever talks about. What we're talking about is flavour, taste, variety. We're talking about diets that are high in vegetables. And the kids were just saying, this food's amazing. We don't fall asleep in class anymore after lunch. The flavours are amazing. It really can be done. And the large caterers will say it can't be done, but we are proving.
You've put in a very impassioned argument there, Thomasina. Stay with us. Annabelle, what do you say in response? Are you convinced?
No, I'm not convinced, certainly, by the UPF argument. By all means, try and make...
The ultra-processed foods argument.
Exactly. By all means, make food more healthy in schools. I think you'd struggle to find somebody who's against that. But I'm a bit nervous about this campaign against ultra-processed foods that we're currently seeing. Well, for a start, it's poorly defined. It's not rooted in evidence. There seems to be this one study where for 2 weeks they got a very small group, fed one of them essentially rabbit food and the other group burgers and chips. And when the latter group gained weight and the former group didn't, they said that it must be UPS to blame. But actually,
not sure that's accurate.
Well, that's what that study was, and that's what a lot of advocates for restrictions on UPF. That's what they call on.
There are lots of studies, increasingly, because the evidence is so kind of points straight to ultra-processed food. And in fact, the definition is very clear and tight.
But what these studies aren't doing is giving people burgers and chips which have been made in a domestic kitchen and people burgers and chips which have been made in a factory, and then comparing the health effects of that. We simply don't have that evidence. At least not yet.
There's very little funding for that, because there's the funding and all evidence is largely provided by the big food companies who are making billions every year out of giving people food that is ruining their health. We've got kids going to dentists having their teeth pulled out. We've got kids whose jaws aren't being developed because they're fed a diet of food that you don't even need to chew it because it's so soft and pulpy. Their diets are devoid of fibre, and it's an absolute outrage. It doesn't happen in any other country in Europe. Why in England? Why are we determined to
But I'm not disagreeing with the principle
kids?
of children having healthier diets. My issue is with UPF, and you talked about texture, but cereal is regarded as an ultra-processed food. Crisps, like you said, are regarded as an ultra-processed food. You talked about Pringles and the fact that they're addictive. Part of the reason why you want to keep eating a packet of Pringles is because it has salt in it. Well, try living without salt for a few days, and you'll find that very quickly you die. Well, exactly. But my point is that we've seemed to have targeted UPF without really explaining to people what it is, without considering that cutting UPF out of your diet is very impractical for a number of people. You rightly talked about those who aren't able to cook, they haven't got time to cook. I actually happen to think that this has undertones of trying to get some people, women, back into the kitchen, back by the stove. You know, it simply isn't possible.
Why would I want to do that?
Let Thomasina answer some of those. Well, let Thomasina answer some of those questions. What are they? You were going to list them there, Thomasina, and then go into, is it practical for people, families who are busy and haven't got enough money, perhaps, to buy the sort of fresh food ingredients that may be needed to cook healthier food?
Well, I mean, apart from anything else, many people live in food deserts where there just isn't access to fresh fruit and vegetables. And they're very high cost because they're only sold through convenience stores, which we know are more expensive. The cost of fresh fruit and vegetables has gone up more than any other food cost. So whilst ultra-processed foods are being subsidised in many ways down the food chain, fresh fruit and vegetables are not being subsidised. So there is a definite cost issue for people on low incomes, which is why it's even more important that when they are going to institutions like schools, prisons, hospitals, social care, they're at least base being fed better food. Now, Annabelle, you might have a problem with the label of ultra-processed food, but the food being served to kids in schools is largely ultra-processed, which means they are getting no fibre, no variety in their diet. A lot of it's chemically sprayed, and it is bad for their health. And there are so many studies coming out. Sadly, the money to fund studies is not there because the government is not really willing to look at this because it's a difficult issue to address. They're worried about being accused of nanny state. They're worried about journalists like Annabelle, attacking them of like mollycoddling people and telling them what to eat. We are not telling people to tell people what to eat. What we're saying is the government right now is saying they've got compulsory food education. That is by teachers in classrooms who know nothing about nutrition, who do this kind of awful, like, this is healthy, this is not. We're talking about chefs in the kitchens, inspiring kids with delicious, tasty food, which costs less. If you invest in the skills to teach these chefs, it costs less to feed kids better food.
Let me bring in Colville Ranger. Why isn't the government doing more in response to what Thomasina is saying?
No, I know the government has a broad basis of saying they want to see healthy food in schools and see kids getting a healthy, balanced diet. But I'm with Thomasina on this, and I say that because my evidence base is 2 children under 5, 2 boys, and I'm looking at the impact that it has on them when they eat different kinds of food product, the ultra-processed stuff towards natural, fruit and veg and everything else. And it's shocking. You do see the physical reaction to these foods.
So the government should do more. They should intervene more.
In fact, the letter that's been sent to the Prime Minister by the Soil Association around this, and I saw the letter, I'm speaking now as a parent and hugely concerned about what's happening around ultra-processed foods. I'm concerned about the proliferation in our children's diets of these foods. I'm concerned about what's being given at schools. I'm concerned even at the food in Parliament. Now, as a new parliamentarian, I look at the food...
Well, as a politician then, as a parliamentarian, does the government need to do more? I mean, this headline in The Guardian, Wales to clamp down on junk food meal deals to tackle obesity. The Welsh Government says it will go further than UK Government's plans for England in trying to encourage healthier eating. Is that the way to to go?
Well, that isn't quite what Thomasina's talking about here.
No, but it's another
so
approach.
That isn't the approach that is being advocated. The approach that's being advocated is more about education, getting the right people, the right skills to show and demonstrate and open up the way that we can do this in a way that doesn't harm the cost of living. It can be cheaper to be done. It is more healthy. And I think that's the approach that has to be taken, and that's what has to be understood by government better and other areas to then get the right kind of results that we're looking for.
Just before I come to the other guest, Thomasina, I don't know if you heard that headline I read about what Wales is doing, the Labour government there. Would you like to see England do the same?
Well, I think Boris Johnson did have some great plans around bog-off deals and all that sort of stuff that was shelved. I think the main thing is the advertising towards children. You know, food companies spend millions and millions on advertising junk food to kids, whereas we spend fractions of that amount in actually, you know, feeding them basic good food. There's a proper disparity there. But excitingly and positively, Chefs in Schools, brilliant registered charity, has a training programme ready to roll out. We've got it all tested. We had Guy's and St Thomas's funding to do it. And so any school, any caterer who wants to train their school cooks, who have a key role here, to train them better, to put this great food on the plates at a lesser food cost per pupil per day, then we've got it ready to go.
Well, and would you accept that? A Labour government accept those proposals to go into schools?
Those proposals sound very sensible. I mean, a Labour government's view is that we would ban advertising that's targeted to children on TV and other media for junk food. In Brighton, which is now Labour controlled as of this year, we have banned advertising on bus stops and other public areas that the council controls for this ultra-processed food and junk food stuff. But this seems like a debate that we've never managed to fix. I remember only a few years ago, it only feels like a few years ago, probably a decade ago now, Jamie Oliver coming on and talking about turkey twizzlers. We have and this is another iteration of it. We have not sorted out the problem in our schools. And part of my view is that what's happened in schools is that we have privatised the food part. These multinationals come in with pre-cooked food deliveries that just get heated up in the ovens and then get dished out to children. And what we need to do is reintegrate food processing, food cooking into the school so that the chef in the school is part of the wider school community. And I remember when I was young, my dad joined the governors of the school so that we could ban beef during the BSE crisis, because it was a democratic discussion about what you were feeding the children. And the privatisation of food in our schools is part of this problem.
Sienna?
I think there's a really... I mean, the point that they make in the letter is completely valid. I don't think... I wouldn't have thought that what Thomasina is suggesting there is at all controversial in terms of the food they gave them in schools. I mean, I feel very fortunate at the moment that my one-year-old is in a nursery, which is, of course, private, and it's difficult to get anything else, and she's got a chef based there doing all organic, homemade food, best quality olive oil, all that stuff. They get like a 4-course meal with a cheese board. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Wow, lucky them.
Yeah, but it's really good. And also...
And expensive.
Very, very expensive.
But it doesn't need to be.
It doesn't need... Exactly, it
no.
doesn't need to be. That's just because that's the early education. That's a different conversation. But I mean, having had a baby recently, I think one of the key things, and Bea Wilson is another person who signed this letter, she talks about the importance of the first foods that children have. And having just had a baby, I do this thing called baby-led weaning, which is becoming more and more popular and really should be encouraged, I think, by health visitors and those kind of people.
Yes.
You present babies as soon as they start weaning at 6 months with adult food. So they get that texture, they get the variety of flavours, they don't just get purees, they get adult food from the beginning. I think that's really important.
The difficulty, I suppose, is when you, as a parent, potentially lose control of what your children are eating. As Thomasina said, talking about secondary schools and perhaps when they leave home and they're in their early 20s and so on, which is where they can develop addictions, if you want to call it that, to things like Pringles, for example, and that is the difficulty because it's ubiquitous. Things like buy one, get one free, should these things just stop?
Well,
Annabelle?
no, I think it's crazy to be banning buy one, get one free offers when we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis. And when, just like UPF, junk food doesn't have an official definition. Most people view it as foods that are high in fat, sugar and salt, but that's a massive array of products that we are potentially locking people out of being able to purchase. Look, like I said at the start, I absolutely commend any efforts to try and encourage children to eat more healthily within the school. But the fundamental point is that any efforts at bans or regulations regulations that have been brought in by the government have failed. They've actually been often very regressive, such as things like sugar taxes, penalising the poorest the most, and they are, in my view at least, paternalistic. They are stopping people from being able to make trade-offs and the right decisions for themselves.
At least a base for schools that they need to be providing better and healthier food so that we know all of our children get that in their stomachs at least once a day.
All right, Thomasina, a final word, because we have to move on.
The government definitely needs to put better minimum standards for the large caterers, because it's the large caterers who really need to do better, and they need to have minimum standards about putting some seasonal food in, more vegetables, definitely less ultra-processed foods, which, contrary to what Annabelle says, there's a very definite definition. And if you talk to anyone on low incomes, they know that the food desert is stacked against them. And I've talked to people who go, this is an outrage how me on a lower income, I am particularly being targeted by these companies, and my health is at the consequence. So I don't think if you talk to anyone on low incomes and say, would you like more access to better food? Who is going to say no to that?
Well, on that note, I'm feeling hungry. It's almost lunchtime. Thomasina Myers, thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to end on this story in The Telegraph. Coutinho, that's Claire Coutinho, scraps hydrogen home heating trial after local backlash. Energy Secretary abandons key test scheme in Redcar over supply issues. It's an announcement from the Energy Secretary today. The idea was that around 2,000 properties in Redcar would be heated with hydrogen in a government-backed trial. Those plans have now been scrapped. It's a blow to the companies trying to demonstrate that hydrogen can play a big role in heating homes in the years ahead. Now, the scheme had faced opposition locally, particularly over safety concerns. Let's have a look at this headline from the BBC. Redcar protest over hydrogen village plans. Does this show, Lloyd, that hydrogen is not going to be a big part of how we heat our homes in the future?
Well, the National Infrastructure Commission says it's not. The National Infrastructure Commission says actually hydrogen is really useful because it will replace certain industries where we can't do it in other ways, steel production, etc. But for heating your home, it will be too expensive in mass scale. So they say in some areas where it's difficult to get other forms of energy, yes. And so the trials are important because we want to see where it will happen. Well, one of the reasons it's not going ahead is because there wasn't enough hydrogen. So the government have said today, to give credit to them, cart before horse as always, they're going to launch 3 new hydrogen production plants. Right. And once we get the hydrogen production up, maybe we can go back to the trials. All right, but we are too little, too late,
well, we haven't got much time, but we're no longer going to be the Qatar of hydrogen.
No, we are. It's not that big a blow, because this is one village trial. Then, quite rightly, there were issues around value for money, the source of hydrogen, and local concerns.
And
but
safety.
There are 11 other winners in this funding stream, which will drive about 400 million of investment and 700 jobs over the next couple of years. Hydrogen is still on the agenda for this government and is still part of the plans, but we do have to have the testing, and there's a trial in Fife also still going on.
Other trials are being delayed. Other trials this year have been withdrawn for the same reasons.
Right.
So it doesn't look as if at the moment it's ready to be working.
Right, for heating our homes. Do you think it is going to be part of how we heat our homes in the future?
Well, it's entirely possible, but I'd like to see hydrogen fend for itself in a free market rather than have the government trying to pick winners and force them on people. Most people in Britain today understand that we need to decarbonise, and they instinctively want to do their bit. What they are not comfortable with is having heat pumps and electric vehicles forced on them, often at great cost, and that doesn't seem to be appreciated by our politicians.
Look, I don't think that people are worried about heat pumps being forced upon them. What they're worried about is the cost and the money. And the only way to get the money down is to make sure we expand that market quickly. And that will be same with solar. That will be the thing that brings that money down.
It is costly.
There is always a role.
There are massive subsidies and the uptake is still very low.
Carrot and stick. And there's a role for government. And there always has been a role for government.
So
it was government that
decided
to change. It was government that decided to change from town gas to natural gas. It was the government that decided where energy would be rolled out. It's the government that decided what villages to connect. It's always been the government, and I'm afraid it's fantasy to think that the market can replace it.
I think Lloyd and I will agree on this. There's always a role for government to help pump prime markets as well. I remember setting up the London Electric Vehicle Partnership for Boris Johnson in 2008, when we wanted to get electric vehicles and electric sourcing in, and we had to do something to get those businesses to start doing it. And then you get a market, and then you get...
And on that note, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. Helen Catt will be here with Politics UK tomorrow, and Adam Fleming will be in the chair here on Monday. From all of us here, bye-bye.